Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to bring everybody our cybersecurity webinar. And exciting, the information we're bringing you today is valuable, and the panel of experts we've assembled is top notch. I think they're going to bring you all some good information. Just some quick housekeeping items for everybody. So everyone who's registered for the webinar, you're going to receive a video recording of today's session. And our webinar utilizes a Q&A chat function. So if you have questions as we go, please submit those into the chat, and we'll try to address them maybe during the talking points, but also at the end, we'll save some time to answer any unanswered questions. If by chance we can't get to all your questions, don't worry. We'll make sure we follow up with everyone to make sure all your questions are answered. So quick way of introductions. I'm Marshall Minot. I'm the president of Performance Construction Advisors. If you're not familiar with PCA, we are a consulting firm focused on the construction industry. We engage with clients to help them tackle business challenges that they're facing. We run peer group roundtables for CEOs and their leadership teams, and we provide leadership development through our bootcamp program. On an individual basis, we also provide strategic planning services, succession planning services, executive coaching, and operational assessments. I've been fortunate enough to lead the team at PCA since January after spending 19 years working with contractors. So before we get into the substance of today's presentation, I want to set the stage with a few numbers, just so you appreciate the scale of the problem that we're going to discuss today. In 2024, the FBI recorded over 16.6 billion in cybercrime losses across the United States. That's a 33% increase from 2023, and that's just what was reported. They acknowledge that these figures significantly understate the actual true cost of what's happening, because many organizations, they never file a complaint, whether out of concern for reputational damages, they choose to handle it privately, or simply because they don't know that reporting was an option. Globally, industry researchers and experts have assessed the total annual cost of cybercrime to be in the trillions of dollars. And at an individual level, it's estimated to be about 4.4 million according to IBM. And that figure accounts for everything from investigation and notification costs to lost costs and regulatory fines. PCA is fortunate. We facilitate 30 peer groups with more than 240 contractors, and cybersecurity is consistently a topic that comes up in our meetings. The reality is that construction is not just caught up in the trend, your targets. In a recent survey, more than a third of construction companies reported increases in ransomware attacks, phishing attacks, and data breaches. And on the ransomware front, the sector has been one of the industries most impacted by attacks in recent years, and it's not hard to understand why. Construction firms operate on tight timelines. Every day you process high volume, high value financial transactions. And then there's the data side. Construction firms collect and maintain significant amounts of sensitive information that can be compromised through theft or inadvertence, potentially resulting in regulatory reporting or notification obligations. So that's what today's presentation is all about. We're going to walk you through the three most significant categories of cyber risk facing the construction industry today. First, we're going to cover ransomware, what it is, how these attacks work, and what happens when they succeed. Next, the group's going to walk you through business email compromise and social engineering. Those are the schemes that exploit your business relationships and payment processes to steal money directly. And then we'll talk about data breaches, including the ones that happen without any cyber attack at all, and the legal obligations that they're going to trigger. For each of these, the group's going to explain the threat, share real-world examples from the construction space, and discuss practical steps you can take to protect your organization. And at the end, we're briefly going to touch on how cyber insurance fits into the picture. I'm thrilled to present today's speakers, starting with Josh. Josh Duguid, he's a senior manager at Cyber Risk Services team at Travelers. Josh monitors the cyber landscape for threats that could impact policyholders' environments, and he assists policyholders with mitigating those threats. Josh also analyzes and derives insights from these incident responses and claims data to support the work of his teams. Prior to joining Travelers, Josh spent several years as a corporate defense litigator and a cyber claims counsel. We also have on Erin Ramsey. She's with the Cyber Risk Products Manager for Travelers. She partners with underwriting teams to address product, market, and underwriting strategies for the cyber insurance products. She's been with Travelers for more than 20 years, and in prior roles handled workers' comp claims, underwrote specialty insurance products, and developed policy language, including for the cyber product. Also with us is Micah Hoffman. Micah is the managing director and counsel on the cyber claims team for Travelers. In this role, Micah leads and supports a national claims team of attorneys that handle both first and third-party cyber claims. Micah also regularly provides training and education opportunities on cyber risk trends and claims handling. And prior to joining Travelers, Micah worked in private practice focusing on insurance coverage issues and bad faith litigation on behalf of the carriers. And last but certainly not least, we have Dan Ahmed. He's a senior manager on the cyber risk services team for Travelers. He provides cyber risk expertise across Travelers, working closely with underwriting teams to assess cyber risk at scale and support our agent inquiries. He also works with policyholders and advises on proactive security measures, from recommending security program improvements based on the evolving threat landscape to providing remediation guidance for known vulnerabilities. Josh, Aaron, Micah, and Dan, thank you for being with us today. Thanks for joining us. And Josh, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Marshall. So today we're going to start with ransomware, which is, in our experience, the single most disruptive cyber threat that faces the construction industry today. And we are emphasizing the word disruptive because while we're going to talk about other types of cyber risk later in this presentation, ransomware is the one that can really bring your entire operation to a halt overnight. So at a high level, here is how ransomware works. So an attacker gains access to your network, and once they are inside, they deploy malware that encrypts your files, your systems, your data, and even your backups, if they can manage to do that. Everything that your business relies on to function day to day, so things like project management systems, financials, shared drives, all of that could get locked. And then you're going to receive a ransom demand, typically in cryptocurrency, in exchange for a decryption tool to unlock those systems that were encrypted. Now, in the early days of ransomware, that's where the story ended. You would pay the ransom and you would get your files back. But that model has evolved over the years. Today, almost every ransomware attack also involves data theft. So before the attackers encrypt your systems, they're going to try to exfiltrate data. That could be contracts, employee records, financial information, and then they use that stolen data as a second point of leverage. So even if you have backups that could restore your systems without paying for a decryption key, the attackers are going to threaten to publish your data on a public data leak website unless you pay. So what you're dealing with is really what we call the double extortion model. So they want you to pay to decrypt your files and or pay to prevent data exposure. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when it comes to ransomware, construction was the fourth most impacted industry in 2025, experiencing nearly 25% more attacks than it did in 2024. And it was a major target of active groups like Chelan and Akira and Play. In terms of frequency within our own ransomware claims data at Travelers, the construction industry was the second most impacted last year. And taking a more recent view of the data, attacks on construction firms rose by nearly 40% between Q3 and Q4 of last year, and Q1 of this year appears on track to maintain a similar level of activity. So what makes the industry such an ideal target? Well, there are a few things that Marshall mentioned briefly up front. First, construction companies, they operate on tight project timelines with significant contractual obligations and penalty clauses. When your systems go down, you can't just pause a project and pick it up later without consequences. Delays cascade, subcontractors can't get paid, schedules slip, and liquidated damages start to accrue. Second, construction involves a complex web of relationships, subcontractors, suppliers, architects, engineers, etc. And a ransomware attack on any one node in that chain can have ripple effects across an entire project. And third, many construction firms have invested heavily in operational technology, but haven't really always kept pace with cybersecurity maturity, which makes them attractive targets for threat actors who are looking for organizations where the potential disruption and therefore the willingness to pay is high. I mentioned Akira and Chelan and Play, so I also want to touch on who is behind these attacks. When we talk about ransomware, we're not talking about a lone hacker in a basement. This is organized crime that is operating at an industrial level. The modern ransomware ecosystem runs primarily on what's called ransomware as a service. That's a model that is incredibly scalable. So basically you have this core group of developers who build and maintain the ransomware software. So that means the encryption tools, the leak site infrastructure, the negotiation platforms, and then they recruit affiliates who are essentially independent contractors that carry out the actual attacks using the platform that the operators develop. The affiliate does the work of breaking into your network, deploying the ransomware, and managing the extortion, and then the profits are split between the affiliate and the platform operators. So the financial incentive here is straightforward. Ransom demands for mid-market companies, which include a lot of construction firms, they can range anywhere from the low hundreds of thousands of dollars up into the millions. And when you consider that these groups are running dozens or more attacks simultaneously across different affiliates, the revenue potential there is quite enormous. So this is not petty crime. These are sophisticated, profit-driven operations, many of them based in jurisdictions where law enforcement cooperation is limited or non-existent, which makes disruption very difficult. Next slide, please. So how do these attackers get access to your environment? There are a few primary methods here that we've highlighted that are worth understanding. The first, and this is one of the most common entry points that we see, is through compromised credentials for remote access devices, especially VPNs. So attackers obtain valid usernames and passwords, which they often harvest by credential stealing malware, and they use those credentials to log directly into your network as if they were a legitimate employee. Once they're in through the VPN, they have a foothold that they can use to move laterally and eventually deploy the ransomware. The second most common method is the exploitation of software vulnerabilities in internet-facing devices. Again, we're talking about VPN appliances normally. So when a critical vulnerability is disclosed and a company is slow to patch that, then attackers can exploit that vulnerability to gain access without needing any credentials at all. And then finally, there are, of course, methods like phishing and drive-by compromises, which trick employees into downloading malicious files that give the attacker an initial foothold in the environment. And finally, at the bottom, one thing that we definitely wanted to flag that's relevant to this audience, which is that these attacks tend to happen during off hours. So like nights, weekends, holidays, when IT staff aren't actively monitoring, because attackers know that a Friday or Saturday night deployment gives them the maximum window to encrypt systems and exfiltrate data before anyone notices. So for construction companies where IT resources might already be lean, that timing is particularly impactful. Next slide, please. So what happens when a ransomware attack succeeds? The impacts are pretty significant and they compound fairly quickly. So the most immediate impact is business interruption. Your systems get encrypted, which means your operations stop. Project management tools, scheduling software, accounting systems, all of it could go offline. And for a construction company, that doesn't just mean internal inconvenience. It means you may not be able to coordinate with subcontractors, you may not be able to process payments, and you may not be able to meet project milestones. A study, an industry study in 2023, found that 77% of firms couldn't survive more than 5 days without access to documents before experiencing significant scheduling impacts. And every day of downtime has a real dollar cost attached to it. And then there's that data exposure component that I mentioned a little earlier. So if attackers have exfiltrated sensitive information, the potential consequences extend well beyond that initial attack. You are looking at notification obligations under state breach notification laws, potential regulatory scrutiny, credit monitoring costs for affected individuals, and also reputational damage, which could come with a public data breach, which we'll get back to a little bit later today. And also, in some cases, data exposure can lead to litigation, so things like class action lawsuits from employees or customers whose personal information was compromised. And so the reality is that these impacts don't exist in isolation. A ransomware event is not a single problem to solve. It is a cascade of interconnected problems that unfold over weeks and sometimes months, and that is what makes it the most disruptive risk. So now Micah is going to walk you through what actually happens when one of these events occurs and share a real world example of how this played out for a construction company.
Thanks so much, Josh. So this ransomware claim story involves a general contractor located in the Pacific Northwest. And last spring, this contractor was the victim of a Play ransomware attack, which impacted both of its office locations and unfortunately left the contractor fully encrypted and unable to access any of its systems. This contractor was a traveler's insured and reported the incident to travelers the same day that it was discovered. So we recommended engaging a cyber breach coach, which is an attorney that specializes in data privacy and cybersecurity, as well as a forensic provider to contain and investigate the attack. So within a few hours of reporting the incident to travelers, a scoping call was held with the cyber breach coach and the forensic investigator, the contractor, as well as travelers, and those vendors were immediately retained to begin working on remediating the problem. 2 days later, the Play Group made an initial ransom demand in the amount of $1.7 million in exchange for a decryption key to regain access to the systems and promised not to publish or sell information that had been stolen from the contractor on the dark web. In response, travelers retained a professional negotiator who engaged with the Play Group on the dark web on behalf of the contractor. And after several rounds of negotiation, the contractor ultimately agreed to pay a reduced ransom in the amount of $700,000. And this was facilitated and paid in Bitcoin by a payment processor after an internet crime complaint or an IC3 was filed with the FBI and after obtaining OFAC clearance, which essentially just ensures we're not paying a party designated or blocked by the US Department of the Treasury. This contractor also needed specialized assistance with restoring certain systems after the decryption key was obtained. So travelers also hired a restoration vendor to assist the contractor with that process. And one office location was fully restored within 16 days of the attack. And the second office location was fully restored after 29 days. This matter still remains ongoing today, and the current budgets total $900,000, which is within the policy limit of $2 million. The contractor also recently submitted a claim for business interruption loss in the amount of $75,000, which is still being evaluated. And then we're going to revisit this claim again later in the presentation when we talk about data breaches. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and turn things back over to Dan to talk about ways to prevent this type of ransomware attack from taking place.
Awesome. Thank you, Micah. So yeah, let's get into defense strategies, and hopefully this is really the heart of what everyone walks away with today from our conversation. And really the main question is here, what can you actually do to protect your organization against ransomware? As Josh and Micah both just highlighted, ransomware is one of the most disruptive cyber threats that are facing contractors right now. And, as we just heard from the claims example, we're not talking about a minor inconvenience. We're talking about the type of event that can shut a business down for days or weeks at a time, lock you out of project files, financial records, client data, and that leaves you with a very difficult situation. So I want to highlight 4 key proven controls that can dramatically reduce your overall exposure and improve your security program. The first one here with strategy 1 is phishing resistant multi-factor authentication, or MFA. I'm sure many of us on this call are familiar with MFA. It's definitely talked about all the time, but this is the second step when you log in. This could be the text message or the app notification. But this is where things get interesting, is that traditional MFA can be bypassed. Attackers are very smart, and the classic game of cat and mouse in security, they have gotten very good at bypassing traditional or weaker forms of MFA. It could be intercepting those one-time codes. It could be tricking employees into approving fake login requests. So really that's where the focus shifts on implementing phishing resistant MFA. And the reason it's called phishing resistant and the reason why it's considered a more secure form of MFA is because it uses cryptographic protocols. And that basically just means that the credential is tied to a specific device. And from an attacker perspective, that cannot be intercepted or replayed. So this really levels up that barrier of entry from an attacker perspective. and really ensures that you can prevent that unauthorized access from taking place in the first place. The other key thing to note here is that this also you also have to consider coverage as part of your MFA strategy. So your VPNs, your cloud applications, and any type of administrative interface that has the capability to perform configuration changes. Ransomware groups are routinely gaining entry through the compromised credentials, and they're using this as a mechanism to break into environments. So closing off these external doors on the perimeter matter enormously. The second strategy I want to cover here is vulnerability management. Again, attackers are constantly scanning the internet for unpatched systems, weaknesses, any types of vulnerabilities they can break into. Attackers are opportunistic. So that being said, things like VPNs, firewalls, any type of remote access tools really comes into scope when thinking through vulnerability management. The moment a vulnerability is publicly disclosed, that's really when the clock starts ticking from a defender standpoint. So what we recommend here is a risk-based approach. Not all patches are created equally, so really prioritizing your internet-facing systems aggressively is going to make the difference here. And again, IT and security teams already, they might be running lean, so that's really where this aggressively prioritized base patch management program becomes important. Even beyond that, patching and vulnerability management isn't just about performing a software or firmware update. This could also include resetting credentials or changing configurations. That also too is part of vulnerability management. And the third element here is that you need to maintain an accurate inventory of everything that you have exposed to the internet and everything that's within your network and connected to your network. The classic saying here goes is that you can't protect what you don't know. The third element here is endpoint detection and response, otherwise known as EDR. And this ties back to the security concept of defense in depth, really just assuming that at some point a control will fail. So layering in controls along the attack path will make all the difference. And even with MFA and patching, a determined attacker may still get in. So EDR is really your early warning system that's inside of your network and in your environment. It's a significant upgrade from traditional antivirus solutions because EDR uses behavioral analysis. What that means is that it's looking for certain patterns or abnormal behavior within your network. This could include things like credential dumping, unusual lateral movement between various systems, and even early stage encryption activities. But there's also an important component of this, and that is the 24/7 human analyst coverage. Like Josh had mentioned earlier, attackers know that organizations have reduced security coverage and resources, particularly on nights, weekends, and holidays. And that really comes down to intentional timing on their part. So having human eyes on your EDR system and your network 24/7 around the clock could be all the difference maker between a reactive and a proactive security program. The last element I want to cover here are backups and business continuity. Again, going back to the concept that attackers are smart, they want to gain as much leverage as they can over an organization, especially during a ransomware event. And most of the times, the ransomware and their strategy is really designed to find and destroy your backups because they understand how valuable those backups are from a recovery standpoint. So a backup strategy that is not air gapped, meaning it's physically disconnected or logically stored away from the scene of the crime of your network, is at serious risk. And beyond that, backups alone aren't enough. You need to test your backups to validate that you are able to restore from them and that they are actually a good source of data to be restoring from. This means tabletop exercises, documented recovery procedures, and clear communication protocols between various business leaders at your organization, IT and security. And the goal here isn't to just recover your data, but it's also to restore your business operations as quickly as possible. And those are two very different things. And it's worth thinking through that distinction before an incident as opposed to during one. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Josh to cover social engineering.
Thank you, Dan. We can go to the next one, the next slide. So we've now talked about ransomware as the most disruptive cyber risk facing the construction industry. and how you can mitigate that risk. And so now what we want to do is turn to what is, in our experience, the most prevalent risk, and that is social engineering and payment fraud, which could be accompanied by a business email compromise, also known as a BEC. So where ransomware is about locking you out of your systems and holding your data hostage, social engineering is about manipulating people, exploiting trust, exploiting urgency, exploiting routine business processes to trick someone into sending money to the wrong account. And what makes it so effective is that it doesn't require the attacker to breach your network or deploy any malware at all. They just need one person in one moment to make a decision based on what looks like a perfectly legitimate request. Next slide, please. So the FBI reported about $2.7 billion in losses from BEC schemes in 2024 alone. And over the past decade, cumulative global BEC losses have exceeded 55 billion. Those numbers make BEC the second most costly category of crime in the US. And in terms of frequency within our own claims data, no industry was more impacted by social engineering schemes and BECs in 2025 than the construction industry. So why is that industry particularly vulnerable? Well, it comes down to how it operates. So construction involves high value financial transactions that are happening across a fragmented network of parties like owners, general contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, all of whom are regularly exchanging invoices, payment instructions, change orders. That kind of complexity creates an enormous attack surface for fraud. When your accounts payable team is processing dozens of invoices from dozens of vendors on any given day, a single fraudulent email that looks like it came from a known subcontractor requesting an updated bank account number doesn't look unusual. It just looks like Tuesday. On top of that, many of these transactions are time sensitive. There is pressure to keep payments flowing so that projects stay on schedule. And that kind of urgency is exactly what these attackers exploit. They know that if they create a sense of time pressure, then the person on the receiving end is more likely to act quickly and less likely to stop and verify. Next slide, please. The actors behind these schemes, they range from highly organized criminal groups running large operations to smaller, more opportunistic fraudsters. But the common thread is that this is a financially motivated crime with relatively low barriers to entry. So unlike ransomware, which requires a lot of technical infrastructure, payment fraud can be carried out with little more than a convincing email. And two of the most common schemes that these actors carry out are fraudulent funds transfer and payroll diversion. So taking these in turn, fraudulent funds transfer, sometimes we call this invoice fraud or vendor impersonation, is where an attacker impersonates a known vendor and sends fraudulent payment instructions, typically in the form of a request to update banking information for future payments. So this request looks legitimate. It's going to reference a real business relationship usually, and in a lot of cases, it will probably arrive exactly when you'd expect a payment to be due. So the money gets wired to the attacker's account, and by the time anyone realizes what happened, the funds have been moved and can be difficult to recover. Payroll diversion works on the same principle. So an attacker will impersonate an employee, usually via email to HR, payroll, and they're going to request a change to their direct deposit information. So the next paycheck is going to get routed to the attacker's account. Individually, the dollar amounts are smaller here than with fraudulent wires, but these kind of schemes can go undetected for multiple pay cycles. So how do attackers set the stage for these schemes? Sometimes it starts with reconnaissance, publicly available information. So like your company's website, LinkedIn profiles, press releases, these kinds of things give an attacker a detailed picture of your business relationships and its organizational structure, who handles financial decisions. So if your company just announced a major project with a particular contractor, an attacker could now know that there's a financial relationship there that they could try to exploit. And from there, the most common method just involves the attacker creating a spoofed email address that closely resembles a trusted contact's email address. Maybe it's just like one letter off or uses a slightly different domain. and then the attacker sends the fraudulent request from that address. But the more dangerous version is when an attacker actually compromises a real email account, either at your organization or at one of your vendors. Typically, that's going to be through phishing. And once the attacker is inside a legitimate mailbox, they can read ongoing email threads, they can understand the context of real transactions, and they can insert themselves into a conversation at exactly the right moment with that fraudulent payment request. That level of authenticity is what makes BECs so difficult to detect. And it is also worth noting that vendor side compromises are particularly tricky. So even if your own security posture is strong, if your subcontractor's email gets compromised, the fraudulent request is coming from their actual email address, and there's nothing in the email itself that might look suspicious to your team. And finally, the thing I want to cover before I round out this section is the impacts. So the impacts of a successful social engineering attack, they're primarily financial. When a fraudulent wire goes out, the money is typically moved through a series of accounts quickly, which makes recovery difficult. So for a construction company, losing a 6 or 7 figure payment can have real consequences for cash flow, especially on a project where margins are already tight. But the financial loss could extend beyond just the stolen funds. So there are indirect costs too. That could be the cost of investigating the incident, determining the scope of the breach, potential legal fees if there's a dispute over who bears the loss. There's also a relationship dimension here. So if a subcontractor's legitimate payment gets diverted, someone is going to have to absorb that loss, and that conversation can strain a business relationship that you depend on. So payment fraud doesn't just cost you money, it can cost you trust in the partnerships that your business is built on. So Micah is now going to walk you through what the response process looks like when one of these events occurs and go through a real world example.
Thanks so much, Josh. I have 2 real-world social engineering claim stories to share with you all today. The first involves a general contractor located in the Pacific Northwest. And last summer, this contractor received a fraudulent email, which appeared completely legitimate, from their vendor, requesting that the contractor pay the vendor's invoice by ACH, when historically this contractor had paid the vendor by check. The contractor believed the email was legitimate. They went ahead and sent the ACH payment to the vendor in the amount of $127,000. The ACH payment initially did not go through, which was weird, and the contractor went ahead and resent the payment. The contractor then received an email, again, looked completely legitimate, purportedly from the vendor, saying that the payment was received, but they were unable to transfer it, which seemed odd. And then pretty close in time, the legitimate vendor reached out to the contractor asking where the payment was. And that is ultimately how this contractor discovered that they had been the victim of a fraudulent scheme. So in response, the contractor immediately changed all passwords on their own email accounts and reported the incident to travelers. So pursuant to our recommendations, the contractor retained a cyber breach coach and a forensic investigator. But this is one of those situations where the investigation ultimately did not find any evidence of a breach on the contractor's system. So it appeared that it was the contractor's vendor that experienced a business email compromise that led to the fraud. Overall, on this claim, the investigation costs were less than $10,000, and coverage for the monetary loss was provided to the contractor in the amount of $100,000. And that now takes us to our next social engineering claim story, which involves a site preparation contractor in the Midwest. So for this claim, in January 2026, the contractor was reviewing its bank accounts and observed an unauthorized wire for $1.4 million. The insured immediately contacted their bank to report the fraudulent transaction, but the bank was unfortunately unable to stop the wire from sending. So they launched an investigation and communicated with the recipient bank to try and recover the funds, but that was also unsuccessful. The insured went ahead and reviewed the incident themselves and discovered that one of their employees' emails was compromised. Again, they contacted travelers, We engaged a cyber breach coach and forensics to investigate that email compromise, but we also simultaneously referred the monetary loss to the US Secret Service for immediate attention. The forensic investigation on that claim took about 3 weeks and revealed that the email compromise lasted 51 days, with initial access being achieved by a social engineering or a phishing scheme 3 months prior to the fraudulent transaction. That initial compromised email account belonged to an administrator, and that administrator had the authority to set rules and control access to Outlook. And the fraudster was able to gain access to a total of 9 email accounts after compromising that initial administrator account. And then once the fraudster gained access to the email accounts, they created additional fake email addresses and several inbox rules to redirect and conceal emails. The fraudster was also able to log into the insured's bank account and then granted themselves access to send wire transfers. There is a happy ending to this story, however, because through our partnership with the US Secret Service, we are making a full recovery of the $1.4 million. And on that note, I will go ahead and turn it back over to Dan to talk about prevention.
Awesome, thank you. So in terms of prevention for social engineering, we're going to approach this and frame it from 3 layers: human factors, technical controls, and detection. And reason being is, again, tying back to defense in depth, no single control is sufficient on its own. They all work together. So in terms of layer 1, which is the human factors, the first piece of this is security awareness training. This doesn't include a one-time annual checkbox, but rather regular ongoing training for every member of your staff, particularly focused on folks in finance and accounting that are handling funds regularly. People are your first line of defense. They need to know what a phishing or suspicious email looks like. And really, this will enable them to look out for how attackers impersonate vendors or executives and what to do when something feels off. By doing so, you can empower your users to remain vigilant and really just keep an eye out for any email-based threats. The second factor here is payment controls and out-of-band authentication. This really boils down to accounting and finance processes, never relying on solely an email to verify any type of payment change or new banking instructions. I always like to say that it's not every day that organizations are changing bank accounts or getting a new type of account to change payments for. So that should, already trigger some red flags when that does come through. But anytime there are any types of emails from a subcontractor or a vendor to update wire transfer details, always pick up the phone and call them. And not using a phone number that's in the email signature, because attackers do change the email signature to include a phone number that they control. Rather, use one that you have on file. This could be from a previous purchase agreement or from any type of agreement, but use an out-of-band trusted phone number to call that individual to validate any type of change requests. And again, not relying just on that email. This one habit alone, which does not require a fancy security solution or further security investment, prevents a significant percentage of payment fraud incidents from occurring and from being successful. In terms of technical controls, MFA. So again, we touched on this earlier for ransomware, but this also applies equally here. Email account takeover is one of the primary ways that attackers are getting in and positioning themselves to intercept and divert payments. So preventing that unauthorized email access from taking place in the first place will make all the difference from a prevention perspective. Following that is least privilege and conditional access. Really what this comes down to is users should only have access to the systems and data that they need to do their job, nothing more and nothing less. For example, folks in accounting do not need administrative access to your email tenant to spin up brand new email addresses or maybe create inbox rule for other email accounts. So really just looking through your permissions of your users, does it line up with the scope of their responsibilities or is it overly permissive? This limits the blast radius in the event an account is compromised, and this also applies to your vendors and third parties that may access your systems and data as well, which we'll come back to in the next section. In terms of the third layer, this is detection. So even with great training and solid technical controls, you still need to know what to watch out for from a detective perspective. So what this looks like in practice and what some key signals include are things like login attempts from unusual geographic locations. It could include access at unusual hours, and it can also include multiple failed login attempts. So by looking out for these early indicators, this could basically signal that an account has already been compromised or that an attacker is actively probing your systems. And really the key takeaway for this entire slide here is that you need to layer in these three areas between your people, technology, and detection. And that's what's going to create resilience and best position your organization to defend against these types of threats. Each layer catches what the other might miss. And again, this is going to position your organization to prevent and also reduce the impact of any social engineering based attack. And with that, I believe, Josh, I'm handing it back over to you.
Thanks, Dan. So we've covered the two biggest drivers of claims in the construction space, ransomware and social engineering. And so now we want to talk about data breaches. And when most people hear data breach, they think of a cyber attack. And that is certainly one way that it happens. But what we want to emphasize is that data breach doesn't require a cyber attack at all. And in fact, nearly half of them are caused by human error and IT failures rather than malicious threat actors. So what does that look like? Well, that could be a laptop getting left in a vehicle and getting stolen, or an HR manager accidentally emailing a spreadsheet with sensitive info to the wrong person, or maybe a former employee retains access to IT systems after their termination. These are all everyday operational mistakes, not like sophisticated attacks. It's just someone hitting reply all on the wrong email. And each of them can trigger the same kinds of legal obligations as a ransomware attack or a BEC. In construction, the nature of the work itself creates some of these risks. So you have employees who are working from job site trailers, carrying laptops and mobile devices between locations, and accessing systems from the field. So that kind of distributed work environment really increases the likelihood of an accidental exposure in a way that many other types of companies don't face. Next slide, please. The other dimension is the third-party dimension. So your data doesn't just live in your own environment, it lives with your vendors and your payroll providers and your benefits administrators and your IT MSPs. 30% of data breaches are linked to a third party. And when one of those third parties experiences a breach, your data can be exposed even though you have strong security controls and your own systems were never touched. And you'll still have obligations to all of the affected individuals. So when we talk about protecting data, what kind of data are we talking about? There are two major categories that I want to flag. So the first is customer and project information. So that can include things like client financial data, contract terms, bid information, project specs, anything proprietary. While that kind of data doesn't always trigger legal obligations if it's exposed, its exposure can still create significant business consequences like competitive harm if a competitor gains insight into your pricing, contractual disputes with clients, reputational damage that could affect your ability to win work. The other category of protected data that I want to touch on is employee and subcontractor personal information. And this is where it really becomes a legal compliance issue. So construction companies maintain significant volumes of personally identifiable information, things like social security numbers, driver's license, tax and financial records, benefits data. If you are a general contractor who is managing a large workforce across multiple sites, you may be collecting this information not just for your own employees, but potentially for subcontractor personnel as well. And when you factor in turnover, construction has a historically high workforce turnover rate, the cumulative volume of personal information that passes through your systems over time could be pretty substantial. And much of this data carries legal obligations if it's exposed. So every state now has its own data breach notification statute that defines what constitutes protected information that triggers notification obligations. And the practical challenge is if you operate across multiple states, a single breach can trigger notification obligations under multiple state laws simultaneously, each with its own requirements for timing and content and method of notice. A general contractor who is headquartered in one state with employees and subcontractors working in a half dozen others, they can find themselves navigating this patchwork of different legal requirements just from a single incident. The key takeaway here is that the data construction companies collect and maintain as a routine part of doing business creates a real legal exposure if it's not properly protected. And that exposure exists regardless of whether the breach was caused by a sophisticated cyber attack or by someone accidentally attaching the wrong file to an email. So Micah now is going to pick up from here and walk you through what the process looks like when a data breach does occur.
Thanks, Josh. So we're now going to go back and revisit the first claim story that I shared. If you remember, this was a Play ransomware attack that took place in spring 2025. So the forensic investigation for this matter concluded during the summer. And based on the findings of that forensic investigation, as well as information that was provided by the Play group during ransom negotiations, the cyber breach coach was able to determine what files were impacted and should be reviewed for potentially compromised protected information. So this contractor initially decided it wanted to review the files internally rather than engaging a data mining vendor to assist with that effort. However, after several weeks of review, the contractor came back to Travelers and the cyber breach coach requesting the assistance of a data mining vendor because it was just a much larger undertaking than they had initially anticipated. So in response, Travelers engaged a data mining vendor to review approximately 4 gigabytes of data. During that first high-level review, nearly 850 complex documents were identified. So those are documents with hundreds of entries or that are hundreds of pages long, which require more to review, which resulted in needing to revisit that data mining budget and increase it. So then once data mining was complete, the cyber breach coach reviewed those results and determined that notice was required to over 2,800 individuals, including close to 250 minors. Travelers then engaged a notification vendor to mail notification letters to the impacted individuals, which took place in late 2025. The vendor also provided a call center for any questions arising out of those notification letters and provided credit monitoring and identity theft insurance for a year for those impacted parties. The cyber breach coach also assisted the contractor with notifying the Attorney General's office in several states, as well as the 3 major credit reporting agencies, as was required by respective state laws that Josh mentioned earlier. The data mining and notification costs were actually relatively inexpensive in this matter. They were combined under $20,000. But that's not always the case. Depending on the number of documents or the complexity of the documents that require review, budgets can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars just for data mining. And this is a claim story where the insured was directly impacted by a cyber attack. They were the victim of a ransomware attack that resulted in them having notification obligations. However, it's important to note, as Josh mentioned, that sometimes the insured has notification obligations because data was compromised without an attack, or because a third-party vendor experienced a cyber event that exposes your data. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Dan to talk about how to keep your data safe.
Awesome, thank you. So in terms of focus areas specifically for data breaches, I'm going to start with data minimization. The simplest form of data breach protection is you can't lose data that you don't have, and you can't lose data that you don't store. So with that, really, this is a question, ask yourself, are you collecting and retaining information that you don't actually need? Are there any old employee files, subcontractor records, or any type of financial documents that are sitting around in shared drives that are way past their useful life? You know, the hard answer is I'm sure there's something out there for organizations, and this is really where there needs to be an established and clear retention schedule, particularly focused on things like any type of social security numbers or sensitive financial records. And really the goal here is that when data has served its purpose from a retention standpoint, disposing of it securely. And this includes both paper and digital formats of data. And this is especially relevant in construction, where subcontractor and even employee data often gets retained far longer than necessary. For the second item here, in terms of vendor due diligence and ongoing oversight, this really boils down to third-party risk management. This isn't a one-time exercise that you should only do when you onboard a new vendor, but rather this is an ongoing responsibility, at least annually. Knowing which vendors have access to your sensitive systems and data at all times is really going to make all the difference here. And applying that same least privilege principle that we discussed earlier, only sharing the data with vendors that is strictly necessary for them to do their jobs, nothing more, nothing less, and really have a plan in place for what happens if a vendor is breached. Who do you call? What are your obligations to either your employees or your clients? And how quickly can you respond in terms of notification from a vendor that says they got breached? And in terms of putting this all together, I want to close out this section and really our whole conversation today with hopefully a theme that everyone's starting to notice about how these controls all connect. MFA, EDR, and patching and vulnerability management reduce the likelihood of a successful attack from happening in the first place. Security awareness training and email security help reduce the risk of fraud and social engineering-based attacks. And then ultimately, data minimization, classification, and oversight help reduce your overall risk profile and potential breach exposure. And again, the main theme with all of these is that none of these controls are perfect on their own, but when you start to layer them together across your people, technology, and your processes, this is where you can significantly reduce the likelihood of an attack from happening in the first place, but also reducing the blast radius and the impact when one does occur. And ultimately, that's the goal, not perfection, but meaningful, measurable risk reduction. And with that, I believe, Aaron, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Micah did a great job illustrating for us the types of claims that are picked up in standalone cyber policies. So most standalone cyber policies include first-party components that help you navigate a system intrusion, financial loss due to cybercrime, and business income loss when systems are down. In addition to that, construction companies have exposures that other industries might not have. So for example, with our business income loss, we offer an endorsement to our policies that covers income loss if a construction industry company misses out on a bid or an RFP due to a system outage, or incurs contract penalties if they aren't able to meet project milestones, as Josh indicated frequently occurs when systems are compromised. Most standalone policies also protect you when lawsuits arise from the system intrusion, from theft of or access to information, or when regulatory claims are brought for these violations. Underwriting focuses largely on the areas that Dan addressed, the controls a company has around its systems and information. So we do want to get to some questions here, and if there's anything we don't answer live, we will try to get back to you when we finish the webinar. Let's see, I'm taking a quick look. And I don't think there's anything outstanding that we are able to answer in front of this large group. So Marshall, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, great. Once again, thanks, Josh, Micah, Aaron, and Dan. Thank you so much for the content. I think it was really valuable. I think it was important for us to make sure, not just framing out for this group what cyber risk looks like, but give you some actual takeaways. So as you go back and hopefully as you go back and look at your firms, you have a better idea of how it can manifest itself and how you can, as Dan was saying, minimize the impact if it does happen, minimize the exposure that can happen to you. I think maybe give us another second if any other questions come in. We did have some questions come in during the webinar. They're pretty specific. We try to answer those as they came in. But if there's additional things that the group would like us to follow up on, we can do that. We have a really good expert panel here as well that can answer any questions. Anything else coming in? Any of the panel?
They're coming in quickly all of a sudden here. So just trying to kind of take a look and see if there's anything we think we can answer easily here. See, several came through at once. I think given the number that kind of popped through at once, our best bet will be to follow up with folks offline, with the exception of, I think we saw a couple of questions about receiving a copy of the webinar.
Yep. Yeah, so definitely everyone, you'll get a copy of this webinar. The recording will be sent out. We'll make sure that contact information is available. Sorry for running a little bit short on time to answer everything in depth. Some of these questions, they seem very simple in the face, but they require an in-depth kind of a technical answer that we'll make sure we get back to everybody. So thanks again, everyone, for the time. Thanks for the panel. Everyone be well.